Hello, I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to Macduff Lives, and thanks again for our good friend Harley Schlanger, who rearranged his schedule to be with us on a Thursday today. We, for the record, get together every other week on Tuesdays, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. But here we are on a Thursday together, and I'm so glad we could make a show this week after all. Harley, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, John. I would hate to miss an opportunity for us to have a discussion.
All right. Well, game on then. Let's go. I had actually titled this show "Is World War III Inevitable?" And it's my, I see people concerned about World War III all the time. It's in my feed on my Twitter. It's like everywhere. World War III coming, and then the pictures with like with Kamala with the mushroom cloud on her head and everything, but it hadn't really gotten that deep inside of me where I thought, hey, this is getting really scary. But now I'm at there. That's where I'm at. I'm saying this is really scary, and just to give you the things that are triggering me to get there is this. No, number one. We don't know who holds the nuclear football in the White House. We don't know who is running our foreign policy.
Yeah.
We don't know, except for it looks like the State Department is now running our foreign policy. And that means Tony Blinken is running our foreign policy, which in and of itself is frightening. And it is. And then you have the issue of the long-range missiles, the high-tech missiles that can travel all the way into the heartland of Russia and hit places like Moscow and major cities or anything that they want to. These are clearly American or NATO weapons. The Ukrainians could not possibly build them, and they admit these are NATO weapons. And they have NATO people there that are assisting, and then these kind of, the sheep-dipped mercs, the mercenaries that just change their clothes and then go back and do their job that they did in the military for this foreign power. The NATO seems to be throwing all into trying to start World War III, and so they had every country in NATO except for the U.S., I think, and maybe Britain, to say, okay, we can send them. I think they're called Storm Shadows in the British version, but we can they already have them. We can let them fire them. Well, that's scary. The next thing, the Houthis get a long distance missile of very high tech and fire it into Jerusalem. And my military commentators that I follow are suggesting that was Putin sending a message to the West saying, don't do this, or remember, we've got these too, and we can distribute them to whoever we want to, and just think twice before you do this. Well, that's maybe was the underlying message, but then we have now the latest thing, which is a major attack, was said to be by drones, Ukrainian drones, on a huge storage facility where they keep the Russian version of the high-speed missiles, along with a whole lot of other military equipment, missiles, etc. And it had a huge explosion. It lasted for hours. And so that, I wonder, is that NATO saying, hey, you just hit Jerusalem, now we're going to hit you. And what's going to happen next? And I'm still on tenterhooks because we have not heard anything from President Putin of Russia to explain the Russian version, because who knows exactly where or how those drones got to that facility, which is deep inside of Russia, far away from the battlefront. And those things make me nervous.
Well, I think the most important thing we heard from Putin was when he said, if you start using these long-range missiles in Ukraine, shooting them into Russian territory, then since we know that the Ukrainians are not capable of doing that on their own, that it's NATO. And this will be an indication of NATO declaring war against Russia. Now, what the Russians have always said is that they would reserve the use of nuclear weapons only for the occasion that it seemed as though the very survival of Russia is threatened. Now, I think people need to keep in mind that Putin says only what he means, and he means what he says. And the fact that you have the British press filled with these stories, Putin's bluffing, Putin hasn't done anything, Putin's holding back, Putin is frightened, Putin doesn't want this, on and on and on, which is, poking the bear in the eye. It's a provocation. But meanwhile, the Russians are pulverizing the Ukrainian forces in Donbass and doing it with a purpose in mind, which is to severely weaken the capability of the Ukrainian military to fight back. Now, at the same time, they've cut off most of the people who went into Kursk. The Russians can survive some of these hits they're taking, and they have other options besides nuclear. The Kinzhal missiles, the Iskander missiles, the hypersonic missiles that can't be shot down. They can use them to hit almost anywhere with pinpoint accuracy inside Ukraine, or they could hit sites in NATO countries. And I don't think they're going to launch a strike on London or Paris, but you have to consider that they may target, for example, a city in Germany where you have a Rheinmetall plant, because Rheinmetall is the leading beneficiary of the German defense spending. So there are lots of options that they have, but the feeling you get in the pit of your stomach is legitimate, because we're seeing an escalation across the board. Look what just happened the last 2 days in Lebanon. The use of these pagers and other electronic devices. If you think about it, what does this mean? This means that if you want to be safe, you shouldn't allow anyone to take a cell phone onto an airplane, because it now means that these become weapons that can be used. And the people who did this were sending a message. Now, the message they sent to Hezbollah wasn't received. I mean, the message they were sending to Hezbollah is, you're vulnerable, we can get you anywhere. And Hezbollah said, we're going to keep fighting, we're not going to give up. Don't think you can demoralize us, but expect that we're going to come back at you. So virtually the whole of Israel now, and the whole of Southwest Asia, is a combat zone. In Europe, it's still Ukraine, a little bit of European Russia that's a combat zone, but that could change. So you do have the real threat that this thing could expand exponentially. And what would be the result of that? Well, so far Putin has withheld the use of any of these tactical nuclear weapons or anything of the sort, because the Russians know if you go to nuclear, the whole world is going to be destroyed. The Russians know that. The question is, does an idiot like Blinken understand that? Jake Sullivan, the people pulling the strings in Washington, in London, the new foreign secretary, Lammy of Britain, is a total provocateur. And he went with Blinken to Kiev, the foreign minister, I should say, went with Blinken to Kiev to talk to Zelensky about providing the Storm Shadow missiles and giving a go-ahead. And apparently someone in Washington put on the brakes, at least temporarily. Now, it may very well be the military is saying to Biden, you sure you want to do this? Because there are people in the military who understand it. Now, what we're doing, and this may be increasing your anxiety, is that we're bringing into the International Peace Coalition legitimate experts on nuclear war. People like Ted Postal, a Massachusetts Institute of Technology professor, who was involved for many years with the Defense Department and weapons procurement and development. Postal did a week ago a very powerful report on what would happen in Germany if the Russians launched a nuclear strike, because the Germans are saying they're going to accept the U.S. long-range nuclear-capable missiles. And I got a lot of feedback from people who said, this scared the hell out of me. What do I do? So, you're right, John. People are beginning to get a feeling that something could go out of control. And at the same time, the establishment is trying to keep people on the edge of their seat by saying things like, Putin's bluffing, he's not going to do anything. We can go ahead and use these long-range missiles. So it is an unprecedented threat for the extinction of mankind. And that's why you're feeling uneasy. I have trouble sleeping these days. Before I go to bed, I look in the eyes of my children and think, I've got to do more to make sure they're going to have a future. And I think a lot of people are thinking that way. It really reminds me when I was a kid and the Cuban Missile Crisis was unfolding. And the night that Kennedy gave his speech, where he announced the embargo, the blockade, and the steps to stop the flow of nuclear arms from the Soviet Union to Cuba, that night my father, who was always understated, but he had been in World War II, he'd been very much involved in the Allied invasion of France. My father, when I went to sleep, said, I hope I'll see you tomorrow. And I didn't really understand at first why he was saying that. And then I remembered watching Kennedy speak with him that night, and I didn't sleep that night. And I have somewhat the same kind of feeling when you see someone like Blinken blithely discussing nuclear weapons as though there's no threat from it, that no danger that it gets out of control. So, and then just parenthetically, you look at the discussion at the United Nations yesterday, where they took up this measure from the Palestinians to condemn Israel for the occupation. And this was already the International Court of Justice, the ICC, the other international court, criminal court, have already concluded that Israel is engaged in a plausible case of genocide. And so when a vote was taken to end the occupation, there were 146 nations, I think, who voted for the measure. There were only, I think, 12 who voted against it. And one of the 14 voted against it. And the two of them were the U.S. and Israel. It's unbelievable that the U.S. continues to run cover for Israel, given what Israel is doing.
Let me ask you this. What is the American interest in Zionism? Well, why is the United States supporting a regime in Israel that has part of its reason for being is to create this greater Israel and become like this the chosen people, writ large? What does the United States gain from all the support that we give to Israel?
Well, from the political side, the politicians know that the religious right, the Christian fundamentalists, will vote for anything that will support Israel because they actually believe that Israel is the vehicle to bring on the second coming of Jesus. And this goes back to the so-called British Israelites and the Christian Zionists, who believed that you needed to have the ingathering of the Jews, that is, all the Jews from all corners of the earth come to Palestine as a precondition for the second coming of Jesus. And by the way, most of the Jews who come there will be wiped out in the Battle of Armageddon. So it's not as though they're doing the Jews any favor. But that's the political side of it.
I just want to, don't forget the other side of it, but I just want to say, every time, and we've gotten to this conversation before, in my life, I've never met people that say what you just said. I have my relatives from Georgia are usually Baptist Presbyterians. I know lots of people of different Protestant faiths, but I don't. Is it in statistics somewhere that this particular version of Christianity, which is really kind of a almost a Zionist Christianity, really has the power, the political power that you're ascribing to it?
Well, take a look at the Bishop John Hagee, Hagee, from the Cornerstone Church in San Antonio. This is one of the largest mega churches in the country. And he has, I think, 130 churches that are connected to him, and his program is run all over the South. He's the one who's written this whole theory of the version of the rapture. Now, then, I don't know if you remember this, there was a whole series of books about Left Behind.
Yeah, sure.
This was a bestseller. I think this was during the Bush period when we were in the Iraq War.
True.
The 15 million of these were purchased. Mm. People read them. They discussed them. There were church study groups to understand what are the signs of the second coming.
And I just shrugged my shoulders and said, "Oh well, I remember that. I remember that the way that they were just promoted like crazy on television, and gosh, 15 million and." Well, all right. You're making.
Let me just finish. I was in Texas at the time. I lived in Texas for 30 years.
Yeah.
And I undertook a study under the direction of Lyndon LaRouche to figure out, are these guys crazy? Are they getting kickbacks from the military-industrial complex? What is it?
Okay.
And you actually do have true believers. And essentially, there are people who think that their life is not worth living. It's miserable. And that you're not supposed to be happy. You're supposed to put your faith in Jesus and wait for the second coming. Now, that brings us to the other side of it, because those people, if it were just that, it wouldn't be a movement that could control the Congress. And John, by the way, if you go to the Congress, you'll find there are congressmen, especially Republicans, who do believe this. Republicans in the U.S. Congress and the Senate who believe this stuff. Wow. But the thing that makes it sweeter for them is that this fits the narrative of the military-industrial complex. And when we talk about the military-industrial complex, we're not just talking about defense sector companies. We're talking about financial cartels. We're talking about the BlackRocks and Vanguards and the State Street financial interests who make huge profits from the military. You're talking about the global cartels that make profits because the imperial system of the 19th century still exists. They're still looting poorer countries. Now, when you put that together, I mean, if it were just the military-industrial complex, would they succeed in bribing congressmen? Well, it's when you put the two together and then add on top of that the funds from the Zionist lobby and the fear that people have of being called anti-Semitic. And this goes back to the other side of it. So there's actually a third side. And this explains what's going on in Germany, which is the attempt to create the idea of collective guilt over what happened with the Nazis, what the Nazis did. And in Germany, what you see until recently is that someone who proudly proclaimed himself to be a German nationalist, not a Hitler supporter, but someone who was proud of being German, they were accused of being Nazis. The idea of nationalism and industrial development, being proud of your nation in Germany, was considered a signpost that you were a secret Nazi and you were doing the Heil Hitler with your friends and so on. And this is a powerful effect in Europe, where there are still very clear remnants of the Nazi period. You still have neo-Nazis running around in Ukraine. So now this explains why so much in Europe is oriented towards supporting Israel. when you ask yourself, if you look at Israel today, is Israel deserving of the support of the world while they're massacring children in Palestine? Why is it that no one's raising their voice over that? And it again comes down to the Christian fundamentalists. It comes down to World War II Holocaust guilt. And it comes down to the funds from the military-industrial complex. You put that together, and that's a pretty powerful grouping. The problem is that it could get us all killed, because the people who are benefiting from this in Israel, the ones you mentioned, the greater Israel fanatics, they are crazy. Ben-Gvir is willing to blow up the Temple Mount, what he calls the Temple Mount, what the Muslims call the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They're willing to blow it up. They're willing to storm it and do whatever they have to convey to Muslims they're not welcome there. So there's a totally irrational side to this. Then you ask yourself, well, what does Biden think about this? I think Biden has basically political calculus behind what he does. Same thing with Harris and the people supporting Harris. Do I think Kamala Harris loves the Jewish people and wants to protect them from hordes of Islamic terrorists? No, she's trying to get elected. What does she want to do if she's elected? Well, she knows that if she supports these guys, she'll get more money and she'll get the favorable press coverage. So much of this is practical politics on top of insane cultism, on top of greed. And I think that defines, that's why my talk today on the daily update was whatever happened to common sense. And by common sense from a LaRouchian standpoint, we don't just mean the ability to connect things and live in reality, but actually to have the critical thinking to get above the crisis and understand why you're being manipulated and how. And I think if we fight for that restoration of common sense in the population, we can win this, because I don't think most Americans believe in the crazy stuff that John Hagee teaches. I don't think that most Americans, except if they have stocks in Northrop and Grumman and so on, I don't think most Americans think the military-industrial complex should have a blank check to go anywhere in the world and blow things up. And I don't think most Americans believe that God told the Jewish people that they can control all the land from the Nile to the Tigris, Euphrates. So why is it that people step back and say, well, Israel has a right, they have a right to exist, therefore they should do this? It's a irrationality on top of greed, on top of just plain pragmatism.
It's funny to think, it reminds me of "You Move, You Lose," which was the rule in childhood, and I thought, well, geez, if they God gave them all this land, why did they give it up? But it's gone now. That's the way I look at it.
Well, and if you look at I get a lot of emails from people who say, how could you say the British set this up? It's there. I've got a whole row of books behind me. Historians,
I do too. I'm 100% with you.
Just you have the more moderate revisionist historians like Tom Segev wrote a book called The Seventh Million, who talked about how the Holocaust was used to create the sense of the inevitability of the greater Israel. Then there are books about Meir Kahane and the crazy side of the Jewish Defense League and so on, that produce today people like Ben-Gvir, who, what are they defending? They're defending the Israeli soldiers shoving nightsticks up the rear end of young Palestinian males and torturing them and saying, well, that's good. That's what they deserve. They say, people like Smotrich, the finance minister, says that killing children isn't bad because those children will all grow up to be Hamas. And so you're dealing with high-level irrationality. And sometimes it's hard to understand why people are irrational. And Then you have to look at the media. And I think that's the other point. The media doesn't tell the truth about any of this stuff. I don't know if you ever watched the Gray Zone, Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal. They did an expose about the Hannibal Directive, that the Israeli military has an order, that a standing order, that if Israelis are about to be kidnapped by terrorists, you should shoot them to deprive them of having a hostage they could use in a trade. And what they wrote was a series of articles that said that this was probably, out of the 1,200 who were killed in the October 7th, anywhere between 300 and 800 or 900 were probably killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. And after they were called monsters, anti-Semites, and on and on and on, then Haaretz and others did their own investigation, the Israeli press, and they said, well, that's true. It probably was a lot of friendly fire casualties. And it wasn't even friendly. It was designed to kill. So we were fed a load of bull about what actually happened on October 7th. And very seldom do you read in the stories about this why the Palestinians would be so angry that they would be willing to sacrifice themselves for the idea of a state. And you have to think about, what would it mean if for 75 years your land was taken by someone else? So, it's a complex story, but it's not that difficult to understand that the solution, you can't have a policy based on getting retribution for what was done to you before. And this is where I see the biggest problem, whether you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. The idea is that all human beings are children created by the same God. And, they talk about, are there human characteristics of all religions? And you get people who will pick a sentence here or there out of the Bible or the Quran to say, well, see, they believe in killing non-believers. Well, you can find that in any of these books. But the question is, what's the higher principle in monotheistic religion? And it is the idea that God the Father is present in all of us. And do we act on that in the interest of all humanity? Or do we carry grudges and fight for revenge until we destroy each other? And this is where statesmen have to come forward. And when you're dealing with the Blinkens and the Sullivans and the Pompeos and the Boltons, these are not statesmen. These are murderers. These are paid assassins. And the American people and the Europeans have to throw some of these people out. There's no other way to deal with it.
I saw a piece yesterday in which it linked Victoria Nuland and Tony Blinken, I think maybe the Vindmans, but with another name that I had not realized, and that is Merrick Garland. And it said that all of these people had grandparents that were fought against the Russians, and as a result of what happened to their families, they are engaged in this, what I would call a continuing blood feud to try to destroy Russia. That was the case that was made in a minute or two of a blurb I was watching yesterday, but it stuck with me. I thought, I didn't know about Merrick Garland at all, but I've been very suspicious of him ever since Oklahoma City. But is this a force or that we should recognize, the anti-Soviet Ukrainian Jewish force that seems to be so present in our government?
Well, it's not anti-Soviet, it's anti-Russian.
Right.
Because if you look at it, if you look at where this comes from, there are people like Keir Giles, who's the chief anti-Russian for Chatham House, who's written a couple of books where he just lies repeatedly about what the Russians believe. And he said, look, if Putin weren't there, there'd be another Russian who was doing this. They have this idea that the Russians are brutal, they're imperialists. And what they do is a classic case of they take their view and impose that on the Russians and say that that's what they're dealing with. Yeah, a lot of this, but you talk about Blinken, you talk about all the people you mentioned. What does it go back to? The center of this in the recent period in the United States has been Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski is the key Russia hater who developed the strategy for how to destroy the Soviet Union and the Russians. Now, he's not the only one. Brzezinski came out of a group of people that go back to the Harvard University, the whole group of anti-Russian theorists. People like Fritz Kramer, who was a pro-Nazi, who went to the University of Chicago. Volstetter. This is where people like Wolfowitz come from. And some of it is Jewish anti-Russians, but you had a whole bunch of, there's a whole other side to this. You have the Jewish Renaissance connected to Sholem Aleichem and others who essentially said, look, this has been a fight in history. We've got to, we still want to be part of these countries. We still have to live in the world as opposed to being isolated. And you had a very strong anti-Zionist faction within the people who were Jews in the United States, even up to and including 1948. So the problem is that the Brzezinski faction, and this also included Madeleine Albright, these are the people who say whatever we do is justified if it's going to break apart Russia. Now, interestingly, one of the people I find very fascinating on this right now, because I had a very negative, hostile view of him from what I had known previously, is Jeffrey Sachs.
I was going to ask you about Jeffrey Sachs, because you mentioned, of course, the Harvard group in which he was a younger member during what we now call shock therapy. So, yeah, I've always thought, well, why should anybody listen to Jeffrey Sachs? He was one of the people that set up Russia to be carved up by the oligarchs.
Well, I haven't fully concluded that his current story is the full one. But what he's saying is that his view when he was brought in, and he was brought in to work first with Gorbachev and then with Yeltsin, after he had worked with Poland.
Right.
And his view was that if you're going to de-Sovietize, that is, break away from the centrally controlled communist system, you need to have a shock. You need to break up the state sector and so on. Now, he says that he was not an advocate of the privatization, at least the way it was run, where you basically had a gold rush of London and Wall Street bankers who came in and looked at Russia and said, look at all these raw materials, look at these state companies that control the nickel and the cadmium and the lithium and all these other strategic metals. Look at the factories that could still produce things, the working force that could be deployed. Let's go in and grab it while we can, while there's not a central government to protect it. And that's what happened during the 1990s. And there's an excellent book by Sergei Glaziev, who's one of the leading Russian economists, who is also a great admirer of the works of Lyndon LaRouche. Glaziev is one of the chief economists of the Eurasian group. He's worked with Putin in the past. He said that LaRouche was the best economist of the last part of the 20th century. Glaziev wrote a book called Genocide, which just goes through how the privatization and shock therapy reduced the population of Russia, lowered the life expectancy, and was a disaster for the average person. Now, what's interesting is you're beginning to see that coming out because of what Sachs is raising. And Sachs is basically saying that shock therapy was reduced to shock, but no therapy. And what he's saying now is that he was fighting for extending credit to the Russian industries, not to the oligarchs who were set up to take over these. Because what happened is the Westerners came in, they needed to have Russian partners, so they got partners. People like Bill Browder got partners and set up these companies that were just exporting all they could of raw materials. Anything that was worth anything was getting shipped out of Russia. And this was stopped by Putin, but there was a fight against it before Putin around Primakov. And Primakov in 1997 was the one who first said the alternative system would be to have a Russia-India-China alliance, which coincided with what LaRouche was saying, which eventually became the BRICS. And in the rewriting of history, the media says there was this Goldman Sachs figure who was the first one to talk about the BRICS and the potential for them, which is true. A Goldman Sachs guy did talk about it, but his idea was, let's work with them to make them part of the globalist control. And LaRouche was saying, no, if you want to break away from globalism, you need a military and economic force that can do it. And what happened is, as China advanced economically, it became the real anchor around which you could do this. So Russia, India, China were the key. But in terms of population, in terms of commitment to science, technology, and so on, that was the grouping that would work. So what Sachs is saying now is that he was never in favor of the kind of privatization, which was essentially theft, and that he worked with Yegor Gaidar, who was one of the leading Russian economists, to try to get credit. And he tells this story, and I assume it's true. He went with Gaidar to a G7 meeting. And what Gaidar was going to propose was a credit system that would allow the Russians to invest in their own industry and technology. And after the meeting, Gaidar came out looking like he'd been beaten up. And Sachs said, what happened? And Gaidar said, they won't do anything. They won't give us the credit. And Sachs said at that point, he realized he had to step back away from it. But then he said, well, he tried for another year to get the credit flows. Now, if what he's saying is true, it actually coincides with another story, which he's now talking about also, which is the expansion of NATO. Because Gorbachev was told that Russia could be brought in as a partner to the West. And Clinton, well, Baker told them that, James Baker, then Clinton. But at the same time that Clinton was spinning this thing of the partnership for peace, that all of the Eastern European countries could go through a process to eventually become part of NATO and the European Union, that in private they were saying, no, we're never going to let Russia in. And so there was this undertone of tell them whatever you need to tell them to get the nuclear weapons away from them and to break up the military bloc, the Warsaw Pact. But in the meantime, don't ever bring them into the club. And I think when Sachs develops these points, he's doing them accurately, because I've read through some of the archives of the discussions that went on at the various meetings where Yeltsin was promised he'll get a seat at the table, and he never did. Where the Russians were told, yes, you can be in a military partnership with us, and they never were invited in. So, you put the two together, and then you look at the meetings that have gone on since the fall of the Soviet Union, and especially since 2014 after the coup in Ukraine. What you see is groups like the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the so-called free trade Western neoliberal organizations have been calling for the breakup of Russia. And they say it's because we don't want Russia to be an empire that threatens Europe, but it also has to do with wanting to grab the raw materials and finish the job from the 1990s that was stopped when we went into the 21st century. So I think there you see the question of greed, the question of old-fashioned British geopolitics. Don't let Europe ever have, ever have partnership with Russia. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's unfortunately a belief that could lead to nuclear World War III. And that's the danger that we have. So on Sachs, he's given us a couple of interviews. I find him to be quite straightforward when he talks about the Ukraine war and the anti-Russian view of the NATO forces. He's also fairly good on this whole question of what are you going to do about the Southwest Asia, Israel problem. I'm not sure I 100% trust him, but I think it's useful that someone in his position who was there, he was meeting with these people, he was in some of the discussions where the question came up of should Russia go along with this? And so, to that extent, I think he's certainly worth reading and listening to on this question.
Well, thank you for that. That's very valuable to me. As you can, I'm always looking for somebody that I can rely on, at least to a certain extent. It's just like reading all of the books that get on the New York Times bestseller list. Well, they're always going to have something that hooks you back into the narrative, but
Yeah.
they disclose a whole lot of stuff in the first 8 or 9 chapters that is really worth taking in, and perhaps that's the way to approach Jeffrey Sachs.
Well, I think the place to start is the NATO enlargement, because there were people who were competent people in the West who knew that would be a trigger for a Russian reaction, including Jack Matlock, who was the former ambassador to Russia from the United States. Matlock was Reagan's choice, and then he served also under Bush as the ambassador to Russia. He just did a very interesting interview with Mike Billington from the Executive Intelligence Review from our organization. It's available at the EIR online. Very, very interesting, where he confirms that Baker said we're not going to go 1 inch eastward with NATO. So he's one of the eyewitnesses that is really quite useful. Sachs is another. And then you get from the military side people like Colonel McGregor, who talk about why it was clear that as Russia was no longer a military threat, why continue to push them? Same thing with Scott Ritter. Remember, Ritter was involved in decommissioning some of the nuclear weapons in Ukraine and elsewhere. He was brought in to make sure that the communists were not going to use the weakness of the West to launch preemptive nuclear strikes. So there are people who are there and who know these things. And, you can find them. Judge Napolitano has a whole stable of them right now. And, I think they're quite interesting when it comes to what's going on in Ukraine. The question is, does someone like Blinken or Sullivan, what do they know? And this is where the Nuland question is so important. Nuland is tied to the Kagan family through her marriage to Robert Kagan. And the Kagans are a second generation of the neoconservative movement. And this includes people like William Kristol, John Podhoretz. These are people whose parents were part of the creation of the neoconservative movement, like Irving Kristol, Midge Decter. These names may not be familiar to people, but they came out of a Trotskyite movement in World War II and became the leading anti-communists, quote unquote, who created the neoconservative movement and basically took over the Republican Party, which, you had on the one hand, the Taft network. You had a group of Republicans who were really the original America First, didn't want to be involved in the rest of the world. But that then seeped the neoconservative, we've got to fight against the Russians, seeped into that neoconservative outlook. And so this is where you see people like McCain, uh, uh, Lindsey Graham, the ones who are saying anything we can do to disrupt and hurt Russia is good for the security of the United States. And if we can get someone else to die doing it, that's even better. That's the best deal there is. And that's what we're seeing with the Ukraine war. And then you look at Israel, people tend to miss the elephant in the room when it comes to Israel. Everyone's focused on Zionism, the question of the Jewish question, and so on. What they're missing is what else is going on in that part of Asia, because the so-called Middle East was seen by the British as Southwest Asia, and an area that had to be controlled by the British, going back to the 1880s with the formation of the Arab Bureau in Cairo, competing with the Indian subcontinent imperial group over who would control the Arabian Peninsula, not because of oil, but because of strategic location. And these were the fights that were going on in the British Empire. And so if you understand that, you can see that a big part of the establishment of Israel had nothing to do with the Lord Balfour's love of the Jewish people. Why do they give the Jews a homeland? Well, for the same reason they fostered fights between Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics. That's how you control the land. That's how you control the governments. That's why they created India and Pakistan the way they did, with Pakistan, a predominantly Muslim country, and India, a Hindu country, so that you have these constant conflicts. This goes back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement from 1915-1916, the secret agreement between the British and the French on how to carve up the Middle East. And what we're seeing today in Lebanon is a product of that Sykes-Picot Agreement, because Lebanon and Syria were given to the French as their territories to control, whereas Palestine and Saudi Arabia, Jordan were ceded to the British. And what did the French and the British do? They figured out how to use the different religious groups and ethnic groups and tribal groups to pit them against each other, so you would never have one strong power in that region. And that's what we're seeing today. Except, I will say, in Lebanon, I was on a television show yesterday in Beirut, and what was interesting is that what used to be called the Christian Phalange movement, the right-wing Christians who the French set up, who were always at odds with the Hezbollah and the more so-called moderate Muslims, they're all unified today. What Netanyahu's pager explosion has done is unified the entire population of Lebanon. And so while he thinks this is a clever way to destroy Hezbollah, he's actually creating a more unified opposition. So, if you study history, you learn these things. If you don't study history, you get manipulated. And I think that's one of the things I got from Lyndon LaRouche long, long ago, when he found out I was a history graduate student. And I asked him, after the first lecture I attended, where he talked about how the Nazis were created as part of the trust movement of Wall Street, London, and Germany, the rubber trust, the Standard Oil Trust, and so on. I said, well, how do you know this? And he said, well, what do you do? And I said, I'm a history graduate student. And he said, well, make sure you study history properly. Go to the library and learn this. You'll see. And, it stuck with me.
Terrific story, and a legacy that you pass on to others. I really am just always so thrilled at the depth with which you can go in answer to my questions or my nervousness as it comes along. As I see things and I get, oh my God, but the the other question that if we have a couple of minutes left to look at is, of course, the United States. You spoke about breaking up the Soviet Union, but I think that there are those in the same business that would even more like to break up the United States. What comment do you have on that?
Well, I think there is talk about the coming civil war, and this is always framed as left versus right. The Trump says that Harris is a communist, and the supporters of Harris say Trump is a fascist, and they're trying to convince people that it's a left-right fight. Has nothing to do with that. Look, this is the mythology. The idea that Kamala Harris is a communist, who's benefiting from, if she were to become president, who would benefit? The billionaires. Since when is communism a system of creating billionaires? So people who say that just don't know anything, but they'll take the fact that they're using identity politics or reverse identity politics to fight the other side. And they take people who don't know too much and convince them that what you're fighting is communism or fascism. Or if someone says they're for America first, they're a Nazi fascist. This is playing fast and loose with the reality. The dividing line is those people who believe in the idea of government as representing the interests and welfare of the population, and that governments are instituted among men to protect the general welfare, to provide security, to establish the conditions in which people can have a meaningful life. That's what the Founding Fathers wrote about in the Declaration of Independence and what they wrote about in the preamble of the Constitution. They meant it. And the fight in the United States has always been between this concept of the general welfare, in which you elect representatives who supposedly will represent the interests of their constituents, as opposed to the interests of the private companies and firms that pay for their campaigns. That's what the fight is about. It's oligarchism versus a republic. But people don't understand that. They talk about our democracy. They should read some Plato, read the Republic, see what they had to say about our democracy. Read the Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, where you have a brilliant example of what quote unquote democracy means, where you have the back-to-back speeches by Brutus and then Mark Antony after the murder of Caesar. And when Brutus explains why Caesar was ambitious and he had to be taken down, the crowd is cheering for Brutus. And then 10 minutes later, Mark Antony does a brilliant mockery of Brutus's argument that Caesar was ambitious. And all of a sudden, the crowd is with Mark Antony and against Brutus. This is what Plato wrote about as to how democracy can lead to tyranny. And that's what a republic is supposed to be about. And this is the real issue that we're fighting now. In a republic, who ultimately decides who gets rich, who gets the benefit? Well, you should have representatives who are committed to the general welfare, not the private special interests. But our system right now is all about private special interests. And in the long run, the left and the right are unified, for example, in support of wars. It was amazing to me in the debate, the Trump-Harris debate. They disagreed on Ukraine, and that's important that Trump is now saying we have to end that war. But on Gaza, they were arguing about who is a better friend with Israel. They were both presenting the policies of the military-industrial complex. And when it came to a vote last July, when the question was, would we give another 95 to 100 billion for these wars, Speaker Johnson finally switched sides, and instead of representing MAGA and the anti-war side, went along with Hakeem Jeffries and the Democrats, and voted for the $100 billion to go to Ukraine and Israel. And he did it after supposedly meeting with Trump and getting a go-ahead from Trump. So what can you conclude from that? The Republicans and the Democrats love war because it greases their palms. And so there's something more profound here than left, right, liberal, conservative. And you can certainly use identity politics and this question of wokeism to show the differences when it comes to abortion, gender, things of that sort. But
you're not supposed. I have to interrupt you. You're not supposed to say woke anymore. That's we don't say wokeism. Everybody gets upset if you say woke.
All right.
Yeah, you can't win with that word. It's like, oh, you can't call me.
Well, no one. Thank you for informing me of that. I must have been asleep when the order came down.
New rules, according to Bill Maher. Yeah.
Yeah. But in any case, you get the point. The identity politics is used the same way geopolitics works between nations. You divide people up by the lowest common denominator. And that way you can get people fighting over who controls the garbage cans in their neighborhood, while in fact they have less and less garbage because there's not enough food for them to eat. And they're so intensely fighting over who determines which day the garbage is picked up that they lose everything else. So, that's how these identity politics work, and it's a perfect example of geopolitics. Writ small.
All right. I know I need to let you go, but did you see Jamie Raskin, the representative from Montgomery County, Maryland, a very strong liberal bastion and the son of the communist
Marcus Raskin.
Right. He says some of the craziest things. And one of the things that he said on this clip, he said that we have to do a Article 14, Section 3, I think it was, which refers to removing somebody from office because of their conviction of a felony or some other reason. And if we don't do that, we may have to have a civil war. I'm not quoting him exactly, but this is the voices that I worry about that the liberals are hearing. And so I go, oh my God, well, and then the everybody just sits back and like, who cares? They just try to assassinate a former president twice, and nobody cares. So that are we not just being conditioned to let it happen when it happens? And then we had Trump saying something that almost sounded like I've been to the mountaintop in his most recent speech, where he said, I'm going to go to Springfield, you may never see me again. I'm going to go to Springfield and I'm going to go to Aurora. And it sounded like to me that he was saying he knows that something bad is going to happen to him. And that, any comments on that before we have to wrap it up? Because I think there's still an undercurrent of people that really want to have a big war in this country as soon as they can make it happen.
Well, I think you're right. And I think they tend to be driven by other interests, because who's going to benefit from a civil war in the United States? Not the people. Not the people. And we don't have an Abraham Lincoln to lead it, to get us back together.
All right. Well, that's the way it is. September 19th, 2024 at noon hour, when we have to say adios to our good friend Harley Schlanger until we see him again in about 10 days. It'll be not next Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that. And boy, always an exciting and very illuminating conversation. Thanks again, Harley.
I look forward to seeing you then, John.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.